Troubleshoot there.
No, they want us to share. Yeah.
Free
Welcome to the panel on dollar hegemony. My name is Pierre Fink, and it's my pleasure to introduce our commentator, Perry Mehrling. By my count, this is event number 4 for him at this conference, so formal introduction seems a bit out of place. Instead, I will just thank you very much for all the work you've been doing for this conference, and we are looking forward to this panel too.
So it's my understanding that this panel is composed of individual submissions that the conference organizers said, oh, there's a theme here. Let's call this theme dollar hegemony. What I will observe, and I'm going to give my commentary after all the 4 papers, is that a way to understand this panel is that it's dollar hegemony from various places in the hierarchy of money. We are going to start at the top, okay, with the United States, and we are going to proceed farther down the hierarchy, you will see, and over time. We're changing the order a little bit from the program. The first 2 will be swapped, and I'm going to ask each speaker to identify themselves as they see fit. And I'll ask John Crawford, please, to be the first.
Thank you. Should we just introduce ourselves before we
Yes.
Okay, start our presentations?
Yes.
Perfect. And this is the... Okay, great. So I'm John Crawford. I'm a professor of law at the law school formerly known as Hastings, which is now University of California College of the Law, San Francisco. Yeah, I write on financial regulation. So I wanted to just start with some of my background assumptions. Thanks to Mengyi, I kind of did a run through before this and realized my slide deck is way too long, so I'm going to skip a lot of the content and just kind of get to the gist of things, which is that most of the money out there is consists of the short-term debt of financial institutions. That debt is runnable. Widespread runs constitute a panic, and a panic is, where do I point? Oh, sorry. Yeah, widespread panics are just really bad. They're among the most damaging economic and social events that can occur and should be avoided. And so this is my starting point, and this is based on Morgan Ricks's, he's the one who laid it out, I think, best in his book, The Money Problem. I start kind of from a domestic standpoint, at least, saying that the optimal kind of reform approach would begin by defining deposits and money claims functionally, restricting the issuance of those to licensed entities, guaranteeing those claims without a cap. By the way, I'm not going to try to defend these, but I'm happy to if you want me to. This is just kind of my starting point. And then applying all of the familiar regulatory tools, capital requirements, activity restrictions, portfolio restrictions, and so on to kind of mitigate any moral hazard issues that come from this system. So the question I'm asking here is how does this reform approach jibe with the international use of the dollar? And just to make it clear, there is vast creation of dollars in the offshore markets right now. Lots of just fractional reserve banking that occurs outside of the US jurisdiction. That's also vulnerable to panics, and the panics on the offshore dollar markets are just as much of a problem from the US perspective as panics in the domestic markets. In fact, starting with the runs on asset-backed commercial paper in 2007, most of those were actually located in the Cayman Islands. And so it's all one system. The Fed now, I know that other people are going to talk about this more, mostly addresses this through central bank currency swap lines. Thank you. So essentially, if there are institutions that are experiencing dollar-denominated runs in another country, now the central bank in that country is able to access dollars from the Fed to on-lend those to those institutions. And there are, I argue, problems with that. First-order fairness concerns being front and center. Essentially, this is another example of privatization of gain, socialization of losses. These are, that you are providing a safety net to institutions that are not paying for it and that are not submitting themselves to at least the full scope of the sorts of prudential regulation that is meant to mitigate the moral hazard issues that come from the safety net. Related to that, there are legitimacy concerns. I admit that the central bank swap lines are fairly opaque, but to the degree that people have visibility into them, they might not be the best look in the same way that the sorts of emergency actions in the domestic sphere in 2008, for example, were not always the best look. There are the various inefficiencies that come from the implicit subsidies that exist because of the swap lines that can create all sorts of general inefficiencies. And in general, there's just vast amounts of dollar creation that's occurring right now outside of the US. Does anyone recognize that guy? I wouldn't have known him until I did a Google image search. It's John Connolly, one of Nixon's Treasury secretaries, who famously told a bunch of European finance ministers in the early 70s that the dollar was our currency, but your problem. And I think that now offshore dollar markets in a real way, to some extent, reverse that. Now, from the US perspective, the dollar is your currency, but it's our problem. The question I'm wrestling with is how would regaining control over this system affect the dollar status as kind of the dollar's as the dominant international currency. And then that kind of led me down another rabbit hole of research, which is how much should we really even care? How important is dollar hegemony? Is it good? Is it sustainable? And it could take up the whole session. These are the slides I'm going to skip, and it's a shame because you'll see as I slide through them. I would have deleted them, but Susan had already uploaded this. I talked a little bit about the Triffin dilemma and the new Triffin dilemma, and Perry actually just forwarded me a fantastic article that I'm halfway through by Robert Macaulay and Michael Bordeaux that I think will deepen this. And I know Perry also writes about it in his book, Money and Empire, which is sitting on my bedside stand in my lavishly appointed room in North Hall right now. And so I'm looking forward to digesting those and deepening that. But the upshot is that is dollar hegemony good? I ultimately conclude that I think I'm much more ambivalent about it than I was when I started the project, but I think there are reasons to believe that the benefits outweigh the costs, and particularly that any plausible alternative would not. I think there's not a persuasive case that whatever drawbacks the current system has, that plausible alternatives would necessarily improve on that. Is it sustainable? Going back to kind of these new Triffin dilemma type arguments, I'm not persuaded by the various arguments out there that dollar hegemony is doomed. At the same time, it's not a law of nature. I think that this is the straw on the proverbial camel's back. There are things that the US could do that would hasten a time when the dollar status might crumble. I quote the famous Rudy Dornbush line about in economics, things take longer to happen than you think they could, but then they happen faster than you ever thought they could once they get underway. So this morning, Jonathan Kirshner made a great point that he was wrong about how sticky dollar dominance was. He used the 4 legs of the table. Now there's only one, and wow, it's still going on. It still persists. He said the reason he thinks is because there is no alternative, but at the same time, he noted that there's never been a higher demand, in his view, for an alternative. And there are things that I think could that the U.S. could do which would undermine that. So this is just a kind of reminder to me that if the dollar maintains its current status, entities in foreign countries will need to be able to hold dollar-denominated bank accounts and get dollar-denominated credit. So any reform approach that tries to regain some degree of control over dollar creation abroad, I think would, the way I put it is it needs an enabling aspect and a disabling aspect. An enabling aspect to ensure that there are, quote, safe money options out there to satisfy dollar demand. And the disabling aspect would try to suppress the unsafe dollar, the kind of shadow banking version of that. So on the enabling side, in the paper, I kind of begin walking through three possible approaches, obviously not exhaustive, but this is my effort to kind of sketch out possibilities. One you could call the maximal control approach, which would essentially say that any entity that's issuing dollar-denominated deposits anywhere will have to be directly regulated with a direct ex-ante guarantee by US regulators. And I argue that that approach is probably not wise for a couple reasons. One relates to the capacity of US regulators, country-specific expertise and things along those lines. And also, perhaps just as important is, I argue that it would represent a sort of regulatory imperialism that could be counterproductive in getting the sorts of cooperation that might be necessary, on the one hand, to maintain the dollar status, and on the other hand, to get buy-in to try to enact the disabling side of any reform project, which I'll talk about in a second. Another possibility is what you might consider narrow Eurodollar banking, where you would allow foreign domiciled banks to continue to issue US dollar-denominated deposits, but they couldn't create the money. How would that be possible? Essentially a sort of narrow banking model. US banks, subject to US regulation, would create the dollars by lending to the foreign domiciled banks, and those banks would lend that money on to their depositors. They would create deposits. So essentially, all their dollar-denominated deposits would have to be matched with their own account at a US-based bank. And I argue, so that's another possibility. I don't love that possibility either. I think there's still a degree of regulatory imperialism that would irritate allied regulators. And then it's worth noting that it would address the run risk, I think, when matched with the disabling aspect of the proposal. Probably better, I think, than the current system does, but it wouldn't necessarily address the kind of issues related to moral hazard that arise with the kind of extension of the dollar, of the safety net to the entire dollar system. For that, you would need a lot more cooperation from foreign regulators. And that kind of takes me to my third approach, which is kind of what on the enabling side, what I call the tweak the status quo approach. And under this approach, you would continue to allow fractional reserve banking by non-US entities, but you could tighten the system along several dimensions. One dimension would be essentially trying to get, and this again, these are marginal things, but you would try to get greater harmony and greater substantial equivalence between the prudential rules that apply to offshore dollar banking and onshore dollar banking. You could limit, again, this is kind of making de jure what exists now in a de facto state, you could limit the issuance of dollars by offshore entities to jurisdictions that have standing swap lines with the US, and then it might be worth considering charging a fee for those swap lines, even when they're not in use, which would represent kind of recognition of the insurance function of those swap lines. It could also potentially represent a mechanism to try to control overall dollar global supply to the degree that it was designed well and that there was pass along to the private entities within these offshore jurisdictions. So that's basically kind of the models I map out. I'll say a bit more about the take home, but first, the disabling aspect would prohibit the issuance of dollar-denominated money claims, liabilities, deposit liabilities to by everyone except for licensed banks. And part of the reason why this is a possible approach, this is a graphic I borrowed from Stefan Morau, who I believe bases it mostly on the work of Perry, is that there's this hierarchy in the dollar system, in which everything that counts as kind of a dollar or a money claim needs to be redeemable for something above it in that hierarchy until you get to base money, which is pure fiat money. And so in the dollar, most offshore dollar transactions are from my understanding, are cleared in the US. There are ways that you could do it which would shield it from direct US supervision, at least one remove. I've read that the chat system set up in Hong Kong can clear dollars on its own. But ultimately, that entity will need to be able to clear dollars in the US. And so there's a piece by Abraham Newman and Henry Farrell called Weaponized Interdependence, which talks about, it uses financial sanctions as one of their key examples, but it's broader than that, which talks about when you have these networks, the countries that lie at the center of those networks can, quote, weaponize their position to achieve various goals. And part of that they call the panopticon effect. The classic example would be the US leveraging of the SWIFT network after 9/11 to get visibility into terrorist financing. But the essential point is that in order to clear chats, for example, dollar transactions by chats, you could say, we want visibility into what you're doing. And then there's, of course, the choke point effect that they talk about, which involves essentially denying clearing to rogue dollar issuers, and if they were really serious about it, secondary violators who enable the clearing by rogue dollar issuers. So this is something that they could do. When you talk about straw on the camel's back, my understanding is that there are a few things that are more that are thicker bushels of straw. Apologies, I should have worked on the metaphor a little bit more. But the basic point is that there are a few things that irritate allies as well as foes more than the application of this. So the more buy-in you have from foreign, you're going to need to use this to some degree. Morgan's talked about kind of trying to have a Basel-like accord to try to get buy-in from foreign regulators. And the more you do that, the more plausible I think this is. You're going to need to do it anyway to address gaps in compliance and the fact that not all countries are probably would sign up to it, and those that don't could become attractive centers of kind of offshore dollar issuance. So if they took it seriously, the more buy-in they got, the easier it would be. So in conclusion, currently US policy has yielded control over vast amounts of dollar usage and creation in ways that bolster the dollar's international status, but also create panic risk. And it addresses that panic risk through the ad hoc extension of the safety net, which creates potentially huge inefficiencies, risks to public legitimacy, and so on. And recapturing control of dollar usage and creation should be a priority, but benefits of greater control must be weighed against the potential costs of undermining the dollar status. So where does that lead us? Luckily, I have a very straightforward algorithm that yields very clear policy conclusions, and of course I don't, unfortunately, but I love, I was thinking about this, does anybody know who this is? I wouldn't have known it either until I did the Google image search, but that is Judge Learned Hand. The law professors and students might recognize the name. We all read, or were supposed to have read, his opinions first year. And he came up with the most famous equation in all of law and economics, which is the idea, this is from US v. Carroll Towing, 1947, that we should apply, or tort liability should apply in situations where the burden of avoiding, the costs of the burden of avoiding the tort are less than the probability of the torts occurring times the magnitude of the loss if it does occur. But He also said in a later interview, and this is why I put it up there, attempts to quantify the determinants of liability are illusory, and if serviceable at all are so only to center attention upon which one of the factors may be determinative in any given situation. So I see this project as trying to come up with the appropriate variables to help guide these sorts of decisions, and that's kind of all there is. So thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. So the slides are a bit embarrassing because this was actually the draft that I sent out. I've changed the title since, but the earlier audiences thought this was funny, and so I kept it. So let me start by saying this paper is primarily about swapline, and I'm putting this photo up. So this one is actually made by IMF researchers. I wanted to put it up because John's presentation inspired the whole discussion around weaponized interdependence, so I wanted to put the network analysis up first. So I am actually coming more from international trade perspective, and for a while I was working on international trade and US-China rivalry, and monetary policy came into that research when I started thinking about how different spheres of international economic governance interact, regime interaction, and how monetary policy structure international trade. So for swapline, my presentation will go in about 4 parts. The first part, if you're a lawyer, is only 2 parts. The first part is doctrinal. I am primarily looking at how swapline is being justified under administrative law. As you know, there is really no international credible commitment when it comes to swapline, right? So we have to look at domestic law. That's the first part, and then I will go into the qualitative analysis of how the Fed actually made the decision about who to grant swaplines to and who to reject. And so that's primarily based on Fed transcripts and some interviews with officials that have participated in that process. The third part is quantitative, where I look at how trade agreements, investment agreements, and swapline agreements start triangulating each other. So actually there's some glitches in the data, but you will see at least some of the data visualization. And the last part is normative, which dovetails with what a lot of the things that John was saying. So when it comes to administrative law, if you look at how the Fed has justified its use of swaplines, it has consistently justified it under Section 14, which governs open market operation, which is a bit odd because one would think, given that 13.3 governs emergency lending, the role of a lender of last resort would naturally map onto 13.3. And this is not just a technical difference, because these two provisions entail very different procedural requirements and therefore political oversight. Under 13.3, as was amended by Dodd-Frank Act after the financial crisis, it requires the prior approval of the Treasury. So it has the type of political oversight that 14 would not give you. And if we consider the statute to be ambiguous, usually Chevron deference applies, where the court would defer to the reasonable construction of the statute by the agency. But is this one of those significant actions of the agency that would possibly raise a question under the major questions doctrine, which has been formally invoked by the Supreme Court in its decision in EPA v. West Virginia in its 2022 term? So there are multiple factors that one need to consider under the major questions doctrine, and one of the things that I want to raise the most is the geopolitical aspect of it. So this brings us to the qualitative part, where I looked at the Federal Reserve's transcripts during 2008, right after 2008, when they were deciding who to assist. So at no point during the meetings did they actually raise using swap line as a policy tool to achieve concrete policy, unlike the Chinese case afterwards. But there was implicitly an awareness and appreciation of the fact that by creating swap lines and granting swap lines to certain countries but not the others, it creates the hierarchy within the international financial system. And there were recognitions of, for certain countries such as Mexico as a major trading partner and neighbor, and the essential, the necessity of granting Mexico the swap line. But and after the qualitative part, I started looking at more quantitative analysis. And here, I primarily wanted to look at how US and China have constructed their swap line networks differently. As you can see from the photo, the US now has 6 standing unlimited swap lines with 5 other central banks, which constitutes the top tier liquidity provision, as Perry has written. And China, on the other hand, has a much more ad hoc and graded with gradation in terms of the volume that they provide to countries. What is interesting here is that the transcript also indicates that the Fed actually did consult with the Treasury and State Department based on leaked cable. And so this both feeds back into the question of major questions doctrine of whether geopolitical concern is within the mandate and authority of the Fed, and whether in fact it does. So I'm still working a little bit on the triangulation of trade, investment, and monetary policy. So this graph shows which countries have both. So the color indicates whether the countries have both monetary trade and investment agreements with China. So this is the data visualization that I have right now. So probably a logic regression will have to go in there, which I'm still working out. So let me conclude with a few normative notes. One thing that have concerned me the most is what Anne-Marie Slaughter would call the transnational, transgovernmental network, whereby international lawmaking is done through disaggregated entities from different countries. So instead of having the president or Congress authorize formal treaty making, it is done by agencies that is not held accountable both at the domestic level or at the international level. So Basel is an example of it, but swap line is another example. The second normative part I wanted to raise is how exactly are we going to look at dollar dominance, and exactly how are we even defining it, right? Just attending different panels at the conference, some people seem to define it as in terms of reserve. Some people seem to define it as whether the country is acting as lender of the last resort. And on that note, there is a new paper by Horn, Reinhardt, and the co-authors that basically now prove that China is acting as a lender of last resort for a lot of developing countries that couldn't get the type of swap line that the US is granting to the C6 countries or countries that can't get the FEMA repo. So are these complementary? Do we have to have a zero-sum game? Is China doing the work that US doesn't want to do anyway? And how are we going to cooperate more on monetary fronts if we look at similar issues such as sovereign debt and other monetary issues where it is so fragmented and we have these different nodes of influence? So thank you.
By introducing yourself. Yes.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Stefan Mikuska. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Politics at York University, and I guess the odd one out in that I'm not a legal scholar. And I guess we're, as Perry said, going to move down the hierarchy, perhaps to the very bottom. As opposed to looking at kind of global dollarization and global de-dollarization, we're going to be looking at a case of domestic dollarization and an attempt at de-dollarization, the attempt to reestablish a national currency after a crisis. So just to give a bit of context, and I'm not going to go into the history. If you have any questions about the history, we can get into that. But it is, it's a complicated one. But as some of you may know, Zimbabwe experienced a very intense bout of hyperinflation in the 2000s that peaked, the IMF say around 500 billion%. Zimbabwe stopped reporting when it hit 230 million, but estimates vary depending on how it's calculated. Some people say 89 sextillion%. But either way, it was very high, and it ended by demonetizing the Zimbabwe dollar. And prior to that, there's widespread informal dollarization, which is really key to understanding sort of most hyperinflations, right? Hyperinflation as a qualitative definition in that it's a vast flight out of the domestic currency, sometimes into goods, but usually into a foreign currency, and this ends up kind of driving it. And we'll see that happening in this most recent period as well. But the following decade, they were under what they call a multi-currency regime, wherein 9 different currencies were legal tender. But most of them didn't really matter. What mattered was the dollar. At the beginning, the rand did as well, and they, at the beginning, they said that they were going to anchor this multi-currency regime in the rand, but for whatever reason, I could never get a clear answer out of policymakers as to why. But that didn't happen. Government accounts were all done in the U.S. dollar. Banks did all their accounting in the U.S. dollar, and as the rand depreciated against the dollar, kind of in 2010, 11, 12. It gradually got pushed out so that 95% of transactions were done in the dollar by 2016. And in 2019, Zimbabwe reintroduced what at first they were calling the RTGS dollar, which stands for the real-time gross settlement dollar. And it'll become clear why it was called this. But then it was renamed the Zimbabwe dollar in June of 2019, and that's when they ended the multi-currency regime formally. But it didn't last very long, right? In May of 2020, they reintroduced the US dollar as legal tender, but kept the Zimbabwe dollar, and that's because inflation was skyrocketing. So we've seen a return of inflation averaging around 300% in these last 4 years. It peaked at 837% in July of 2020, but I think that peak is about to be surpassed kind of, as we speak. The last 2 weeks actually have been incredibly tumultuous. Not good. There we go. Right, so some organizing questions. Why? Why did they reintroduce the Zimbabwe dollar? Especially, there's been so much social contestation around it. It's so political. Why did they reintroduce it? In other words, why did the multi-currency regime end? Why has de-dollarization remained so elusive? Why has it been so hard? I mean, it's hard kind of everywhere, but it's been especially, the difficulties have been especially pronounced in Zimbabwe, right? And in a related manner, what accounts for that inflation that we've seen? I'm not going to get too much into this first argument, but this is kind of the background, right? That there's, long-term structural issues that underlie the breakdown of the multi-currency regime. And these, again, we can talk about them maybe in Q&A if you want. They go back to the 90s. They go back to structural adjustment. They go back to what fed into hyperinflation. And we are talking about, balance of payments constraints, and that includes, both the global monetary hierarchy, but also, other hierarchies around, production and trade as well. But basically, since the early 90s, there's been widespread deindustrialization, which feeds into these balance of payments constraints. And as I was saying, hyperinflation is usually a balance of payments phenomena. And so my main argument is that this current inflation is driven by a distributional struggle, and that there's a specific form of conflict inflation that emerges in a context like this, wherein the parallel foreign currency markets sort of form the central nexus of a distributional struggle. And what I mean by that is, after the kind of redenomination of the monetary system, groups and actors have been trying to maintain their US dollar income. But not all incomes can be validated in US dollars. So this leads to a kind of widespread struggle over who has access to the dollar and on what terms. In other words, there's kind of widespread social conflict over who bears the burden of devaluation. And that there's a kind of unresolved political crisis, right? The political crisis that kind of was part and parcel of the crisis decade of the 2000s, that remains unresolved, right? And that this current monetary crisis really is a crisis of political legitimacy. Most hyperinflations end with a regime change. Not so in the case of Zimbabwe. There was an election in 2008 when hyperinflation peaked, very contested. The ruling party of Robert Mugabe lost that election. They unleashed a reign of terror, a lot of violence. South Africa stepped in and negotiated a government of national unity. And so they, along with the opposition parties, formed a government together. But they returned to power in 2013. So they were able to outmaneuver the opposition parties. And even after the coup against Robert Mugabe in 2017, where he was deposed by his former prime minister and the military, it's been sort of business as usual for ZANU-PF, a lot of election violence in 2018. And there's basically the monetary authority. There's no legitimacy in the monetary authorities. There's sort of widespread corruption that happens, and this is sort of very well documented. And that money is political, right? And this is sort of very clear in the Zimbabwe case. I should probably get a move on here. So just sort of very briefly, after hyperinflation, there was this, a sort of return to growth, but it faltered. They had high growth rates, but this was from a very, very low baseline. And after hyperinflation, under the unity government, they liberalized the current account, partially liberalized the financial account. There's a flood of imports. They were never really able to get their industrial production online. Zimbabwe used to have one of the most diverse manufacturing sectors on the continent. But again, deindustrialization. They were never, the recovery sort of started to peak in 2011, and it just sort of faltered. And this is when they started to see kind of growing US dollar liquidity crisis. And there's really no exit plan, right, to this multi-currency regime, despite pressures that started quite early on. And it kind of hobbled along after. And so the multi-currency regime, as I was saying, there was four main types of monetary instruments here. So you had US dollars cash, you had bank deposits, which were domestic US dollar denominated liabilities, and mobile money, right? Mobile phone-based payment systems. This is the most common form of payments. A cash-dependent economy, a large unbanked population, very scarce cash. So most things were done through mobile money systems, which was essentially a way of extending bank deposits to an unbanked population, right? And then bond notes, which were liabilities of the RBZ that sort of tried to paper over the cash crisis, right? Formal dollarization it's a hard exchange rate peg, right? I think John's presentation sort of makes clear what I mean by this, and I don't think I need to get into it too much with this crowd, which is refreshing. But money's still endogenous in, under a formally dollarized regime. But there's no exchange rate. And Zimbabwe has had no foreign currency reserves. There's no way for them to sort of intervene in the system to maintain the exchange rate peg. And what starts happening is that those local monetary instruments that I had up on there, these started to trade at a discount to US dollars cash. And this started happening around 2016. So you see the reemergence of a parallel market. And I would say that it was a de facto devaluation. You have a breaking of the peg. The monetary authorities had no way to kind of maintain par clearing, right? To kind of use the language of Perry. And so the exchange rate peg breaks, and this is what forces the attempt to de-dollarize, right? Which again starts in 2019, and they sort of took all of the local monetary instruments and cobbled them together. And since, again, most of this is, these were US dollar denominated liabilities within the banking system, this is why it was called the RTGS, which is of course a payment system. And I've already kind of gone over a little bit of this already, so I will just skip ahead. But again, this distributional struggle that I'm talking about, right? This is what's driving the current inflation, right? Where different groups are trying to maintain their US dollar incomes. And the main way that this plays out is through price indexation. The US dollar has remained the unit of account in the economy. The Zimbabwe dollars has not become at all a unit of account. People don't understand it except through the US dollar. So all businesses index their prices to the parallel market rate. So whenever the parallel market moves, prices move, right? And again, if you want to get more into that, happy to discuss that as well. I did quite a few interviews with price setters in various businesses in Zimbabwe to kind of get a sense of this. And again, this is something that's very, very common in high inflation environments. And if you want to think back to the first day, Brazil, although not to the exchange rate, but a different form of indexation, as well as Israel. Right? This is very common. But this is the main way that this is the main thing that ends up driving inflation. Workers they really push to be paid in US dollars, although they get, they've been getting. This whole thing has been very regressive. They've had a lot of difficulty in especially because there's not a lot of formal employment, and when prices move so quickly, you can't renegotiate your contracts that fast, right? So they kind of rely on their employers to be benevolent. The informal sector, which is very large, is completely re-dollarized. They only accept cash. Exporters really resist, giving up their foreign currency. And politically connected elites have monopolized key import sectors such as fuel and medicine, this sort of stuff, in order to ensure access at official rates, right? And I guess I should say that the difference between the parallel rate and the official rate, this emerges because there is no formal market for US dollars. There's no formal market. Banks don't want to act as market makers. There's a very uneven distribution of foreign currency amongst banks, where you have a group of banks that are the subsidiaries of multinational banks, and local banks, and basically they don't want to trade with each other, and they haven't. And so parallel market dealers have they've filled that gap. So if you need foreign currency, you basically have to go to the parallel market because you can't go to a bank. Now, I'm just going to skip it because I have a little graph here. that shows the kind of evolution of parallel market rates, inflation, and money supply. And just one thing that I'd like to point out is that money supply, the dotted line there, well, basically just the causal sequence here, which is, to me, pretty evident, where first you have the parallel market moving, and then you have prices moving, and then money supply responds to that, as opposed to the other way around. The quantity theory of money is very strong as an explanation in Zimbabwe, so I always feel the need to point out that it's not money printing, that banks are accommodating increasing prices, right? And again, we can get into, there's very direct mechanisms through which this happens. But as you can see, it peaks in 2020, and then it comes right down, the rate of inflation. And that's because they started a foreign currency auction, which allowed businesses to access foreign currency at the official rate, which displaced the parallel market as the benchmark for pricing. And this brought inflation down. And it brought it down for quite a while, although it still hovered around 200%. But eventually backlogs started to build. There just wasn't enough foreign currency coming into the country to accommodate everyone, and not flowing into the accounts of monetary authorities that they could then auction off. A lot of it was kept outside of that. And so backlogs started to build, and people had to go back to the parallel market. And then there's since been a rise again in inflation. There's been a few moments where they've stabilized it, including last year with some very high interest rates, which actually drove redollarization as businesses, all of their working capital loans, since there's 200% interest rates on Zimbabwe dollars, well, they wanted to do it at, they took out loans in US dollars at lower interest rates. And then they launched a gold coin that was meant as a kind of savings device to take pressure off of the parallel market, because whenever businesses have income in Zimbabwe dollars, the first thing they do is go and exchange it for US dollars. And so the idea behind a gold coin was to kind of take some pressure off of that, where you could put it into a gold coin instead, because instead of putting it in, chasing down dollars on parallel markets and then driving the rate. And that there was some stability for a while, but right now things have gone crazy. I actually needed to update my slide. So at the beginning of the year, and again, this started at 1-to-1 when the Zimbabwe dollar was reintroduced. They introduced an exchange rate of 2.5-to-1. When inflation peaked in 2020, the rate had devalued to 100-to-1. At the start of the year, the parallel market rate was around 900. It's I checked this morning. It's hovering around 8,000 right now, so it's devalued from 900 to 8,000 on parallel markets. And the official rate has gone through huge devaluations as well. There are elections coming up in August of 2023, so the instability isn't at all surprising. And I don't have a clear explanation as to what's driving this current bout of instability, because it's happened so quickly. But I'm going to need to get into that as I'm writing. And I'll just where am I going backwards? There we go. So just to kind of sum up what this kind of inflation depreciation spiral looks like, and I won't explain it all just because I think I've taken up enough time. But anyway, here you go. So that's, if you've wondered what's going on in Zimbabwe beyond kind of sensationalism, this is it. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone. I don't have slides, so I'm just going to chat. My name is Christine Abely, and I'm an assistant professor at New England Law Boston. Among other things, I teach international business transactions. So what I'm going to be talking about today is a chapter of a book I wrote. It is going to be a trade book. It's going to come out in 2024 with Cambridge. The idea is it's going to be a narrative account of the sanctions that were imposed against Russia after its invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So the book is divided down into chapters that examines the different types of sanctions that were imposed against targets such as financial institutions that affected the energy markets and so forth. And then also, what were the sorts of different effects in the short term that resulted from the imposition of those sanctions. Certainly there are a number of long-term effects that the book can't deal with because they're not yet known, but I try to discuss the effects to the extent that they're known at this point. So this particular chapter deals with the sanctions that were imposed against Russian financial institutions, and also those sanctions that affected the ability of Russians to engage with the world financial system. So as a backdrop, something that's important to know about sanctions is that they are imposed often in terms of comprehensive sanctions or in terms of targeted or what we call smart sanctions. So comprehensive sanctions are those sanctions which are imposed against a particular jurisdiction wholesale. So an example of these might be the sanctions against North Korea, the sanctions against Iran, the sanctions against Syria. And so what those do is the Office of Foreign Assets Control in the United States, the Sanctions Authority, imposes broad-based sanctions prohibiting any sorts of transactions in goods or services. And there are certain carve-outs from that are permitted, such as for humanitarian activities and so forth. But generally, there are blanket sanctions. That's what comprehensive sanctions are. So the sanctions that were imposed against Russia beginning in 2022 are not those, right? They're certainly sweeping. They are imposed against a large number of targets, but they're technically what we call targeted sanctions, smart sanctions. So these became more popular beginning in the 1990s. Comprehensive sanctions were enacted against Iraq with devastating humanitarian consequences. And so sanctions authorities began to look for ways in which sanctions can be imposed in a more targeted manner. So the Russian sanctions are quite interesting, right? Because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? There was a desire on the part of the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and a number of other members of this coalition of sanctioning nations to impose sanctions that would drastically affect Russia, right? That would have perhaps the potential, at least in the long term, of altering the trajectory of the Russian economy and of creating the capacity for some sort of real change. So the challenge was identifying targets that would have that sort of effect. And so one major portion of the sanctions response against Russia was targeting Russian financial institutions and the ability of those financial institutions to engage with dollar and euro clearing and settlement processes. So one aspect of that sanctions response, you may have heard of, it was in the news quite a bit, was preventing Russian financial institutions, certain Russian financial institutions, from engaging with the SWIFT system. So the SWIFT system itself is not responsible for the actual dollar clearing and settlement. Instead, it's a messaging system, but it's quite essential, right? It's used by a huge number of financial institutions all over the world. It is the practical means for exchanging information by which cross-border transactions are in fact carried out. And so by the EU, in creating these SWIFT sanctions and saying that these financial institutions could no longer use the SWIFT system, it leveraged the sort of weaponized interdependence concept that Farrell and Newman discussed, right? Because of the power of this SWIFT network, the fact that so many financial institutions use this as the messaging system, they use this as the means by which to carry out cross-border transactions, it had great effect. And Russia has been trying to develop payment alternatives, messaging alternatives, but they're not SWIFT, right? And the reason for that is because SWIFT has the encompassing network that the Russian alternative at this point lacks. So that was one aspect of the sanctions response. So a second aspect was the correspondent and payable through account sanctions that were imposed against certain Russian financial institutions. So these had the effect of hindering the financial institutions, of cutting off their access to dollar clearing and settlement by way of the US sanctions. And an interesting part of the sanctions response is that unlike certain other sanctions regimes, this set of sanctions, the sanctions response, was coordinated amongst the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and its allies. So when these sorts of sanctions are imposed altogether of a similar nature, what that does is that leverages the power of the US dollar, right, by cutting off access to the US dollar clearing and settlement, but it also leverages the euro, the pound, and weaponizes those as well. So when similar sanctions were enacted by these different jurisdictions, what that did was that it limited these Russian financial institutions' ability to access different parts of the world financial system, right? So it's not just about the power of the dollar, it's about the power of the pound and the euro as well. Finally, a third aspect of this sanctions response was full blocking sanctions. So these don't just prevent access to correspondent accounts by financial institutions, but these prevent wholesale all transactions with entities that are fully blocked, right? Subject again to certain exemptions. These parties cannot be transacted with at all if the other party is under the jurisdiction of a sanctioning state. So these are quite severe, right? And these were also an aspect of the sanctions response. Certain other financial institutions were made subject to full blocking sanctions rather than just the correspondent and payable through account sanctions. And some of those institutions that were initially just made subject to the correspondent account sanctions have, in fact, those sanctions have been upgraded to full blocking sanctions as the war has raged on and as the sanctioning nations look for an additional sanctions response beyond their initial response in February and March of 2022. And as part of that ratcheting up of sanctions, it seems increasingly likely that the United States and perhaps even the European Union or the UK might turn to secondary sanctions in order to maintain the integrity and the power of its sanctions against financial institutions. My paper talks a bit about how Russia's mere payment system, right, its alternative payment system that it has been trying to develop, the US Sanctions Authority issued an advisory that those who were engaging with the mere payment system, supporting and enabling it, might be made subject to secondary sanctions. So what I've described in the first instance were primary sanctions. Those are sanctions, for example, which were enacted by the sanctioning nations directly against targets for their role in the war effort and so forth. Secondary sanctions are enacted against those who support and enable the primary targets, right? So these are very often used by the United States. We've seen them with respect to Iran. They are much less favored by everyone else in the world, but it's actually quite remarkable that the European Union has signaled that it might be open to secondary sanctions to their use. There's been some discussion of them in its 11th sanctions package. The EU has, in I believe the 9th sanctions package, created a mechanism whereby secondary sanctions might be possible. And so while the EU has discussed secondary sanctions against the possibility, these have not yet been enacted and they may not ever be enacted. They've discussed the possibility that they may enact secondary sanctions against certain Chinese firms. It will be interesting to see whether the EU may also think about secondary sanctions in terms of these in terms of the Russian alternative payment system. So a big question that has been posed with respect to the sanctions is whether or not this could drive trends of de-dollarization, whether or not Russia might turn to the use of its own currency, more likely the Chinese currency, for cross-border transactions. So the answer is certainly perhaps, and we've seen some degree of evidence that that is in fact what Russia is attempting to do. But again, there is the question of these network effects, certainly with respect to payment systems and messaging systems. The networks built by the sanctioning nations are larger at this point. And so that poses certainly a barrier to de-dollarization. And also the fact that, again, it's not just the United States who is imposing these sanctions. They're done in coordination with other, other jurisdictions who maintain certainly dominant currencies. That is a barrier to de-dollarization as well, because it's not a move from de-dollarization to the euro. That wouldn't solve Russia's problems. It's not a move to the pound. It would have to be a move away from that coalition of nations entirely. So I'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much, everyone.
And so now, here, maybe I'm noticing that people are using this as their notes. Well, thank you for all the paper writers. I learned a lot from all of these. You will see that I've organized my comments in hierarchical order, which isn't exactly the order of the speakers. So that's sort of the point that allows me hierarchy in terms of the dollar structure. I am an economist. Okay, we have 3 lawyers and a politics person here. So I'm going to bring the economist hat here about how to understand payment systems and things like that, and use my favorite little balance sheet methods and so forth that you might have seen, since I have been rather present in this conference. So this, I want to start with this. This is the hierarchy. This is a slide I use in a lot of talks. Actually, you may have seen it yesterday. Jay Pocklington sort of took all of this. He put it embedded it in a larger slide. So just thinking about how the international dollar system works, the hierarchy of international money, that at the top is the reserve currency, the US dollar, and that where the central bank is managing the overnight interest rate, and also providing the international lender of last resort through these swap lines that we're going to come to. So that's why Mengyi is at the top. I did her first because that's what that is all about there. A lot of that is private credit. As a matter of fact, the liabilities of the global banks offshore, and I'm going to talk about some of that. Below that are the countries that all have these unlimited swap lines. The euro, the yen, pound, Swiss franc, and some others that I don't think the Australian dollar does, but the Canadian dollars. So these are the majors, so-called. These central banks manage their spreads against the dollar rate to manage their balance of payments. Below them are, let's say, minors, and then below them are countries like Zimbabwe, which hardly have a financial system because of their trouble. So it's a hierarchical system, and it's a hierarchy of hybridity, where it's sort of private money at the top and public money at the bottom, and managed hybridity in the rest of it. There's lots more to be said about that, which I'm not going to do. I'm just using this as an organizing framework for the for reacting to the papers. So here's the swap line paper. I read this paper a little bit, maybe because I'm not a lawyer, a little bit differently than it was presented. The question being, are swap lines legal? There was a lot in the paper, and the answer sort of maybe not under existing authority. But I now know enough about lawyers to say that doesn't really matter that much because they're necessary. Okay, and if they're necessary, we'll find some way to make them legal. And they're very inventive, these lawyers. So they're a big theme of the paper is the sort of contrast of the U.S. swap lines and the China swap lines. I'm going to say some more about the U.S. swap lines for John Crawford's paper. So let me just say something from an economist point of view about the China swap lines. Okay, which is, they're not really swap lines in a certain way. They're not like the US swap lines. Here's the kind of arrangement that you usually see in these swap lines, which is that China has ongoing trade, and as you bring in the trade here, they have ongoing trade relations with these countries, and in particular, I'm giving an example, just I made up out of thin air here, of Chile, where China is buying copper from Chile, and they have long-term contracts for copper, and so they're perfectly willing to lend Chile money because they can get paid back in copper. Okay, so they're not really worried about being paid back, and so that's what these swap lines are. They're actually advance payment for copper. In a way, they're structured as swap lines, and that's sort of interesting. Why would they do that? Okay, and I think some of it is, in fact, to show that they're challenging the dollar. Okay, but they're not actually challenging the dollar. These are just trade. These are just trade accounts for the most part. Now, you mentioned that they are now allowing some of these countries sometimes, to say, okay, we're to sell renminbi for dollars, so that they are acting as lender of last resort. Okay, but again, it doesn't matter. They can be paid back in copper, and they have plenty of dollars. They can defend the renminbi. So that also gives them leverage over these countries. They're structured as a swap, I think, for political reasons, and they could easily be structured in other ways. Okay. So let me move on a little bit down the hierarchy. Okay, this is my sort of summary of my takeaways from the paper. A little bit, it's an attempt to get beyond the Triffin sort of dilemma framing of all of this stuff, which I endorse entirely. Okay, I think that is a very confusing and wrong, essentially, way of understanding the world. But it's so appealing. It's everywhere. People just love it. They just love it. And I think you should examine your psyche. Why do you love it? Why do you love it? So he wants to emphasize that it's a dollar system, not a US Treasury system. And I think that is a good advance. Okay. Second point, in a way, he wants to get us beyond Morgan Ricks, my friend, who wants to kill the eurodollar, and that's how I understand. Oh, yes, he's not. He does want to kill the eurodollar, and I have always had these friendly debates with Morgan, saying, I don't know that that's such a good idea, and I'm glad to have a lawyer who kind of agrees with me a little bit, and that we need to manage the eurodollar system for purposes of global financial stability, is what he's saying. He's also opposed to weaponized interdependence, the sanctions, which we're going to want to come to, so make a link about that. So am I, kind of, but that's not so much, wasn't in your talk, but I think it was in the paper. How many pages was that paper, by the way?
Who's counting?
I
did apologize.
He didn't. I think it was 180 or something.
I think it was like no, it was 80 something. Yeah.
So anyway, I just want credit for that.
There were big footnotes that you can see.
The fourth. So he in the paper also he talks about dollar hegemony. He sort of hinted at the end as a policy goal. That this is a policy goal and a legitimate policy goal. He wants to say, the U.S. is providing a service and getting paid for it. I think I would rather say that it is true that the United States is providing liquidity services to the rest of the world. Whether that should be a policy goal or not. Nixon tried to kill the dollar system in 1971, and the bankers wouldn't let him. So I tend to see this not so much as in the policymakers' sort of control, and from that historical point of view. So I want to just give a little economics here. So these are slides that I use when I'm teaching this stuff. So about these swap lines, okay, about the U.S. dollar swap lines. Okay, not that I showed you some balance sheets for the China swap lines. Here's the most important ones for the U.S. What's the offshore dollar system I'm showing in the top there, where emerging market economies are borrowing in dollars in the last 10 years, loans and bonds, which are being accumulated, I'm showing by Japan insurance companies there, which are funding them in term dollar funding markets, but most of their funding is in yen. So they're trying to get rid of this currency mismatch, and the way they do that is by doing FX swaps with private dealers, with banks. And I'm showing this FX swap there, just in those brackets there, showing what it is. It's like a long position in yen, 3-year, and a short position in dollars. That's what's being swapped. Okay, notionally, and they're not actually on the balance sheet, but that's economically what's happening. That's term funding, 3-month funding, and so France is taking it, I'm showing, all the way to overnight, where they are, but of course they're in euros, so they also have a foreign exchange exposure that they're swapping, and so that's what you see. You see long-term swaps, which are in the yen, and 3-year swaps, and 3-month swaps that are in euros there, and I'm showing FX dealers as being on the other side of that contract. And you can see this is my 30,000-foot interpretation of this wonderful paper by Aldasoro and Ehlers in the BIS quarterly review. So this isn't me, I have no private information. I'm just reading the BIS, and I'm reading all of them, and then I'm adding them up. The BIS papers tend to be focused on one little thing, but so you have to read all of them, and then get the sense of how the elephant is really constructed. And so now I'm showing you where the Fed comes in here, okay? Again, up there I've sort of summarized the BME, Japan, France, just to remind you. And now showing the Fed as having a liquidity swap with the Bank of Japan and with the ECB that is essentially a line of credit to say, if in fact any of your foreign exchange dealers need dollars, okay, we will lend you dollars and you can lend them dollars. And so they're making an outside spread for that. And so that these liquidity swap lines are supporting the offshore dollar system. That's the point to show you, and to show you exactly how they're doing it. The balance sheet interactions. I think lawyers don't think in balance sheets, okay, but I would like them to. Okay, so I'm trying to sell this method and show you how it's valuable. Let me move on to me, the next level down is not Zimbabwe. In fact, you mentioned you think maybe Zimbabwe's at the bottom. I think you're right, okay, about that. So here's some just points about the weaponization of the dollar. A very useful thing I learned from this paper is that SWIFT is not so important, that in fact these direct clearing and settlement interference is really bites, and I don't think that I was aware of that. I know that the anti-money laundering stuff has really been a problem for correspondence systems, for remittances and so forth, and that really has been a problem. But so I'm not surprised to hear that you can get some leverage that way. I didn't know they were doing that. And also direct sanctioning. You didn't mention in your talk, okay, about the grabbing of the reserves of Russia, and also therefore the inability to replenish those reserves by borrowing in world markets. So I want to say some things as an economist about these workarounds, okay, that you mentioned. It's important, and it's important to you mentioned like the network isn't as large or something like that. Okay, well, yes, but here's some more specific troubles with bilateral workarounds. The first is that if you had balanced bilateral trade between China and Russia, okay, you can denominate this trade in anything you want. You don't even need dollars because it's really just barter and you're just trading goods for goods. Okay, so that's no problem. But you can't multilaterally do that. So if you had a deficit with China and a surplus with India, that's not going to work. Okay, so the multilateral trade is interfered with by this. The second thing there is, oh no, I put that second. Yes, so actually the second bullet point is both points. So it requires balanced multilateral trade. If you want to run a deficit against the world as a whole, okay, then you have to be borrowing something from the world as a whole. And if you want to run a surplus, you have to be accumulating something from the world. So getting rid of the dollar system means you have to have balanced bilateral trade with each of your trade partners. Okay, this is how Schock did it. Okay, in Germany, when Germany was pushed out of it had no reserves. Okay, and so you can run a Schockian system, and that's basically what Russia is trying to do. Okay, but it does limit your ability. They were on the other side of this. Jay Poppington might be here and inform us about this. Their trade partners wanted to trade with Germany, so they were willing to take blocked mark accounts, and that they had to spend in Germany, you know. But that's not so much the case here with Russia. The myth of de-dollarization. I just wanted to say a word about that. Hierarchy and its discontents. The countries at the bottom of this international hierarchy are always discontent, and they're always moaning about this, and trying to persuade everyone that it's not fair or something like that. What has given them extra sort of media coverage is weaponization, number one, okay, and tightening monetary policy in the North, okay. So those two things combined have made these voices larger. I do not think that the dollarization is in the cards. It's happening as a symptom of these other things that are happening, but the limits, that's what the second thing is about, are very strong, okay? And it's not so much about the width of the network, existing network effects, as you want. So here's the last one. So Zimbabwe, Weimar, this all very much reminds me of after Versailles, when basically the Germans said, you know what, we don't want to pay, we really don't want to pay, and so let's just let our currency go to hell. Okay, the ruling class in Germany. It sounds sort of similar. Given the hierarchical global structure of currencies, the important thing is that different classes within Zimbabwe, and you emphasize this, and I think correctly so. You're a political scientist, so people might think you're like exaggerating this, but I think this is very important to appreciate, that class structure means differential access to global money. Okay, so the hierarchy that matters here is not the hierarchy of global money, but the hierarchy of class structure inside Zimbabwe. Okay, the third bullet point there, I also want to emphasize, this is also extremely important, you know, in Weimar. Okay, that it's the exchange rate, okay, that is driving inflation. This is not a quantity theory of money thing. It is coming from the exchange rate affecting domestic price levels, and then the money is expanding afterwards. That was completely true in Weimar as well. You might even use that. Okay, analogy. So what we have here is a political crisis manifesting as a monetary crisis, and that the Germans solved this problem by electing Nazis. So this is a serious problem. Monetary problems undermine, of course, the wealth of the middle class, and you don't mention quite that. You know, who is able to? You were talking about people wanting to get paid in dollars. Okay, that's the flow. Okay, but what about the stock? You know, was there wealth? You know, that is there a class that's been completely wiped out, as was the case in Weimar? So that is hell to pay. You know, that's how you get Nazis elected. You know, so that analogy, I think, might be something to consider here. And I think that's my last slide. Yes, it is. Okay, thank you very much. Learn a little economics, or at least this is money view. This is not how all economists think about it. Let me just tell you. So now we have 15 minutes, let's say, and I don't particularly want to manage this. You do.
I don't know that we really need the mic in this room, but
For the Zoom audience.
It's for the Zoom.
oh yes, sorry. This is for John. Why not narrow Eurodollar banking? And I like that. You explained a little why not, but I'm not entirely persuaded that it's too intrusive. It's not that intrusive.
it's an assertion that countries and currency areas are entitled to control their currencies. And we all acknowledge this in certain ways. I mean, is it too intrusive that we care when currency counterfeiting in dollars is happening overseas? Right? We have a whole division within the Secret Service that deals with that. Is that intrusive? Yes. You know, Colombia found it somewhat intrusive when we leaned on it about that. But none of us sees that as, well, maybe we do. I don't think we see that as a huge problem. But we sort of see that as necessary. If you're going to maintain the dollar, you've got to maintain the dollar. And so narrow Euro-dollar banking is, you know, just doing dollar banking just on a pass-through basis. Anyone can use dollars if they want to, consistent with our national security and anti-money laundering rules. But let's set that aside. But you maintain a trust, and it's pass-through and on a full reserve basis, and just draw this strict distinction between use and creation. And you did draw that distinction in your talk. But I guess I'm failing to see a really good, compelling reason for the resistance, and you're sort of admitted half measure, tweaking the status quo, as you put it. You know, how well is that going to work? I mean, I think as I understood you, you know, you're going to charge a commitment fee to foreign central banks for access to swap lines going forward, and you sort of hope you're going to control the price and therefore sort of suppress to some degree dollar creation overseas. How well is that going to work, and how credible is it? You know, suppose central bank X says, actually, we don't want to pay the commitment fee. That's too expensive. We're not going to do it. Thanks very much. But their domestic banks keep on issuing dollar-denominated substitutes. And when a run happens, are we not going to put the swap in? It has all the credible commitment problems that we have with the lender of last resort domestically. One thing that Saleh said in her talk yesterday was structural problems demand structural solutions, and this is an area where we actually have the ability to do it. I mean, you correctly say, I always thought the Basel Accord actually should have been monetary sovereignty. And I think the perceived necessity for a capital accord was a consequence of the sort of underappreciated need for a monetary sovereignty accord. And Basel itself is sort of spun out of control. I had Dan Trullo was here yesterday, and we sat down with him. And Dan Trullo, I mean, the most important non-chair central banker maybe in U.S. history, at least one of them, and also the leading expert in the Basel Accord. He made his academic reputation on Basel. He said he doesn't get it anymore. He doesn't understand it. It's too complicated for Dan Trullo, right? And so these half measures turn into hyper-technical, non-structural attempts to manage problems. And I think we, at some point, we have to sort of get back to thinking about entry as a wall, and not as something we're going to charge a little bit here. We put a margin requirement there. We're going to put we're going to do a little LCR here, and calculate a ratio here, and hope that the system sort of manages itself. And so I think you sort of had there's the hot porridge, the cold porridge, and you have the one in the middle. And maybe the hot porridge is like better after all. The lukewarm porridge is not really that tasty. So that's my bad.
Your microphone.
Thanks for the softball.
I know none of that surprised you today.
Yeah, thanks Morgan for the easy question. And obviously I have a hand wavy response that definitely won't satisfy you, but we can talk more about this offline as I continue to kind of wrestle with the issues in the piece. There are two basic things I would say. The first thing is I don't come out totally strongly against that second option in the paper. There are two things, actually three things. I don't know, it depends on how you count. But the first thing I would say is, as I was thinking it through, the degree to which you need to have assets that back the dollar that are not US domiciled you need to yield some degree, and this gets in, I didn't talk about it as much in the paper, but this Nutriffin dilemma idea, which I kind of don't buy, but kind of going to that particular point, there's this idea that the US dollar needs to be backed by the fiscal capacity of the US, and I kind of question that, and one of the reasons I question that is because dollar creation doesn't need to be backed by treasuries. And one of the ways that it can be created is through these central bank swap lines. If it did need to be created backed by treasuries ultimately, which might have been the view in the late 20th century, then I would probably be more sympathetic to this idea of the Nutriffin dilemma. But that's one of the reasons why I didn't think it doesn't apply. So once you have assets that are backing dollar creation outside the U.S., you're already yielding some degree of control to foreign regulators, I think, almost by necessity, and I need to think through a little bit more. I need to think through that a little bit more. I'm not as convinced. Yeah, I know. I'm convinced by it. You're just like, you're not persuaded by that. The other thing is on the disabling aspect. I really. I mean, I'm sure Christine has thought about this a lot more, but the degree to which people are annoyed by the U.S. using its sanctions power is immense, and getting buy-in on the disabling aspect, I don't think is a trivial thing at all. And I know you've talked about it's insane that we're letting this seniorage slip to Eurodollar issuers, and I kind of see it as a sop to these countries in some way, in a way that's problematic now, but could be useful to bolster the dollar usage, but could be useful if we, as a kind of way to give them something in exchange for their cooperation to try to suppress the stuff that is, I think you would agree, more problematic. The shadow banking versions of this offshore is probably more problematic than the large universal banks that are doing this. But maybe I know you're not satisfied with that. We'll talk more about it, but that's what I got.
Thank you. We would have time for one more brief question and brief answer.
Yeah, so on the weaponizing interdependence question, how does using these dollar sanctions affect the dollar hegemony? Like, it annoys people, right? But is the ultimate effect that it strengthens the position of the dollar or weakens the position of the dollar, or how does it shift, or how are we thinking about it?
There's one right here.
Okay. I think the short answer is that it provides an impetus for multipolarity, right? So the idea is that it's a strong motivator to for countries to develop out a Chinese currency centered model, and it's a very strong motivator, right? Because otherwise Russia doesn't have a viable alternative for cross-border transactions with much of the world, and so it's quite a strong impetus for that.
Yeah, my sense is that in general, Dan Dresner's written a lot on this, that the more the US uses it, the more it pisses people off and adds to the demand that Jonathan Kirshner mentioned this morning for an alternative.
Thank you all so much. That's it for this event, and our final event will begin at 5:15 in Milstein East B. Thank you all.